Welcome, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Steve Carpenter, the Michael J. and Aimee Rusinko Kakos Dean in the College of Arts and Architecture. And this is the first of what I hope to be several interviews, one-on-one interviews with authors from our College of Arts and Architecture. Authors of their own books that they've written.
Oh, well, in that case.
Okay, the program's over then.
This is all AI.
It's all AI. We're thrilled that Robin said yes to this and actually was part of the beginning. Actually, this might have been your idea.
Yeah, it was. It was the department's idea, but yeah, I brought it to you. Yeah.
Yes.
And you said let's do it.
I said let's do it.
Enthusiastically.
Absolutely. Yeah. So thank you, Department of Art History. Thank you to the Office of Research, Creative Activity, and Graduate Studies. Thank you to the Woskob Gallery. Thank you to Penn State University Press. Mm-hmm. They also thought you had a good idea.
They did. They did.
Yeah. So what we thought we would do is let's spend about an hour and a half, hour and so together. I have some questions that I want to share with you, Robin, and receive your responses. We'll have a conversation. And then we'll open it up to questions from the audience in very much the manner of Inside the Actors Studio, if you're familiar with that wonderful broadcast. We'll have a conversation, and then we'll open it up to the studio audience. And I have 5 questions in that transition that you might not be ready for all of them.
Okay, that's fine.
All right, so shall we get started?
Yeah.
Great. All right, so I'm not really big on introductions, reading the bio of people I like to introduce. Typically, you can go on a website and find your name, credentials, where you work, your accomplishments. So you folks can do that for Dr. Robin Thomas. What I'd like to do with my introduction is to just share a bit of insight into what the person I'm talking to or the person I'm introducing, what they mean to me. Robin Thomas is, I've found to be a colleague, a leader, and a thoughtful individual, thoughtful scholar who approaches problems, questions, ideas in a very measured, receptive, contemplative way, and then responds with insight that really helps me frame the rest of what I should have been thinking about in the first place. I found you to be a generous leader and appreciate you taking on the role as department head of art history here at Penn State. I also know that Robin is a mentor and a teacher, educator whose students really go on to do great things. And after jumping into this text, I can see why. So, folks, this is Dr. Robin Thomas, and we are going to have a conversation. So, welcome.
Well, thank you. That's very kind. Very, very kind. Thank you.
You're welcome. So I have a couple of notes here, but before I get to them, I want to say that this is quite a formidable text here, right? I mean, it's got some size to it. One of my mentors would say, "Oh, that feels like a B+." Yeah, right?
It's a little better than B+.
Yeah, it's a little better than a B+. So I found. Here's my response to the text, or at least the way I want to open this up. I started at the introduction, right? Which is usually a good place to start. And I was captivated from the start. I'm not always captivated by introductions, right? You feel like there's some sort of formulaic thing. But for some reason, you decided to start telling this story. And I thought I was reading a novel. I thought I was reading the history of this historic novel, right? And I'm reading about it, and okay, then there's this, folks who think that they know what they want to do, and then let's build some things, but wait a minute, we have this other task. I was on the edge of my seat reading this thing. But it's the introduction to an art history text, which you would think probably isn't the most captivating novel that you might imagine. This is as much a readerly novel to me as it is a scholarly art history text. Are you a novelist?
That's a good question. No, it's based in fact, so that's important. But it's an interesting question. I grew up in a family of storytellers, and that's what when we get together. When 70s family gets together, they play music. When my family gets together, we just tell stories, and often stories we've heard many times before. And I think that structures my way of kind of framing and writing and conveying things in a way that a broader audience can understand and grasp and follow along. Is how can we frame this, conceptually sometimes dense, informationally kind of packed narrative in a way that people can appreciate it. You said, about the novelist. It's just my phone anyway. Don't worry about it. I told the department, we had our department retreat at the beginning of the year, and one of the exercises we did was, what would you do if you weren't an art historian, actually? And this connects to what you're saying. And I revealed that I would have been a poet.
Oh.
That's what I would have wanted to do, probably.
Nice.
And so a love of language, a love of storytelling, those are very important to me beyond just a useful kind of tool in my writing. I mean, I love to read novels. I mean, I think, for graduate students, the best thing you can do to improve your writing, not just graduate, everybody, is read a lot and read fiction. I had my graduate advisor, Joe Connors, he had a wonderfully broad view of how you trained yourself. And he said, some days it's best just to leave the archives early and go home and read Henry James, so you learn how kind of the discipline of kind of language. No one would write like Henry James. It's a very kind of clotted syntax. But it treats you a certain discipline and approach to language. So thank you. I'm glad it succeeds then, because it is a part of the approach that's important to me.
Nice. Well, it came across. I mean that genuinely. It came across. So my background is ceramics, and I was fascinated. There's information in there about kilns that were in these palaces, right? We haven't had a conversation about ceramics, but I'd say you got it right in terms of this is what a kiln is and what it does, and that there needs to be access for workers, and then turning these kilns and these spaces into not only production locations for the palace, but then it becomes a revenue generation, becomes an economic boon. How much did you have to learn about ceramics and kilns to write that well and accurately about ceramics and kilns?
Yeah, I know. There are lots of... The wonderful thing about this book is, though ostensibly it's about 3 palaces, right, in the architectural history of 3 palaces, those provide me wonderful kind of jumping off points to dive down into just areas that interested me. So I could go and look up, what was the process for firing ceramics in the 18th century, particularly, hard-paste porcelain, which requires a very high temperature, the right kind of clay, and all of that. And so it was fascinating. Yeah, I had to read up a lot on it. I mean, I still, if you quizzed me on it now, my response probably wouldn't be so accurate. But I did have to kind of master it at least to write that part. And it was fun. It's fun to kind of delve into that too, because it was a big part of why that palace was successful. So there's a porcelain manufactory on the grounds of one of these palaces, Capo di Monte. So anyway, that's...
Yeah. So the reason I shared that is not just to say, hey, I used to work heavily in ceramics, but I learned several years ago that if you really want to know the credibility of someone's scholarly text, find the piece of it that relates most closely to what you know. And if they got that right, you can count on the fact that the rest of it is probably really good too.
Okay, so I got that right. That's
well
great.
done.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
And there are folks who...
I didn't think about the hazard of that, actually, in you reading the text, knowing about it. I thought, so, whew.
Yeah, the copy you gave me, didn't have those pieces,
cut out,
redacted.
There seem to be some pages missing. Yeah.
I'll check all of the text from here on out. If there are redacted pieces, we'll have some issues. There are folks who read this text before I did, and you asked them to put some words on this, or at least Penn State Press did. They seem to think you know what you're talking about.
I
Right?
appreciate that. No, I'm very flattered by their blurbs, their promotional blurbs.
The promotional blurbs by Heather Hyde-Miner and Melissa Calarezu, they essentially say, look, these palaces of reason, right? These palaces, there are many of them. You wrote about 3. You studied and researched 3. There are many of these palaces, but nobody took the time or thought it was important to talk about these 3 together, or even talk about any of them in the depth that you have. You've made this contribution to the field of art history and to architecture by not only looking at each of these palaces individually and in depth the way you did, but also talking about the 3 of them in relationship to each other. That's remarkable. Why did nobody else have this brilliant idea before you did?
Well, people had written about individual palaces. I think, well, it's funny that we had a visiting scholar who was a historian some years ago, and he was asking me, what are you working on? And I described to him this book. And he said, oh, so a big project for the second project. I hadn't thought, okay, maybe I bit off a bit much until he said that. And then I kind of felt proud of myself. Oh, yeah, of course, yeah, it's a big project, because, yeah, people had studied individual ones. Mostly Italian. There was one American scholar who wrote about one of them some years ago, about 30 years ago, I guess, at this point. But otherwise, no, not all of them together. And because it takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of time. I mean, this is a book, I was just saying, it took 10 years from the time I started researching it to the time it's finished the writing. Because, yeah, it was a big project, I guess, and a little... I don't regret the ambition of it at all, but at the time, when I started out, I probably would have thought, well, maybe not do, but it did, and so it came out well.
Well, we're glad you did. Back to that introduction, you essentially say, look, there are these contexts, the historical, right? We would think an art historian would be concerned with this, but the political, the economic, there's architectural, there's this notion of nobility and folks of wealth in relationship to others. It's through those contextual lenses that you really look at these palaces, right? I found that really refreshing because I think quite often it's easier to look through one lens and say, okay, this is what I'm seeing, but to have this. Not even a kaleidoscopic. I mean, you move back and forth between these. So I'm forgetting that I'm reading about palaces. I'm reading about the stories of their creation, the stories of their use, the stories of what they mean to the society at the times in which they were being built. Because they're each built, they get built over a similar period of time, but some take longer, others less so, and they're created in different parts of the region as well, right? So talk to me about those contextual lenses. Why was that the approach to use multiple lenses rather than just a singular or monocular?
Yeah, no, that's because it interested me. I mean, more than anything. I mean, part of what I do is, approach each building kind of like, I don't know, the archaeology of its story in a way, right? So look at the drawings, look at the documents, establish what is the history of that building process, right? So that has to be done, and that often takes quite a bit of time. But then beyond that, what lenses do these buildings open up onto their time? How can I look through the buildings, with them always in sight, and investigate aspects of what was happening at the time? And so when I set out to do the basic, let's tell the story of, from the drafting table to the completed building. But then along the way, I got interested in these other aspects like porcelain, like economic theory in the 18th century, the middle 18th century, like archaeology and the Archaeological Museum and display of antiquities, relations across the Mediterranean between this Christian kingdom in southern Italy and Muslim states in North Africa and in the Eastern Mediterranean, how that is embodied and represented. Sinology, the study of China in the 18th century. engineering. So I mean, it's maybe, I guess you could say that I was just highly distracted, but you know, I hope interestingly so. I mean, it's good to be distracted. Always, you know, to stay interested in what you're doing by doing so.
Sure.
At least for me.
Yeah, but you know, they're distractions in the service of constructing a more complete story of the palaces, I would say.
Well, thank you. Yeah, no, that's the aim, and also to kind of talk about why should I care about three palaces outside of Naples? You know, I mean, it's not an obvious thing. They're huge buildings. They're incredible amount of resources go into them. One of them is the largest palace by volume in the world still today, actually. So if you filled it up with water, it would hold more water, right? But so there's that. But then why? Why is this enormous building outside Naples? What is it about it why should I care if I'm, you know, not interested in the area? And so trying to tell that story.
Yeah. I mean, it goes back to that question, why did you write the book? I mean, you essentially say because you're interested in it, right? Yeah. But there were more than these three palaces, right? In the collection, there were, what, a dozen or so? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, so they're part of what's called royal sites. And these royal sites were primarily kind
Siti Reali.
Siti Reali, bravo. So they are largely kind of hunting sites, fishing sites. They're lands bought by the crown for the monarchs to go and in a kind of circuit outside of the city. Similar things that existed elsewhere. They existed outside the city of Turin in northern Italy. They existed outside of Madrid. They existed outside of Paris. It was just kind of what monarchs did. In this case, the king who's doing this is particularly interested in hunting and fishing, and so he has probably a larger number of them than some. But then it wasn't always just about that, you know. It was also about the productivity of that land. One that doesn't make it in the book because it comes a little bit later is an incredible one of these sites that is a kind of cow farm where they produce mozzarella. So I should have put that one in. Everyone would love the mozzarella palace.
The Mozzarella Palace. Sounds like an album title or something. Mozzarella Palace.
Yeah.
So these three palaces, one is Capodimonte, right? One is Portici. Is it?
Portici.
Portici. Okay, I got my accent on the wrong
yeah,
syllable, but you know. And one is Caserta, right? So Capodimonte is the largest.
No, Caserta is the largest.
Caserta is the largest.
Yes.
Capodimonte is the longest
It's
written, but but that first the Capodimonte, it was the hunting lodge.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, that's what it's called. You know, a casino di caccia, a small house for hunting. It's not small at all.
No, it's not. That threw me.
Yeah, no, it's huge. In fact, it's a big museum now of painting and primarily painting. And so it's clear from the start that this is going to do something more than just provide a space for hunting. You know, it's going to be more than just your everyday sito reale. It's going to be something grander. And the kingdom's really not ready for that in terms of kind of the infrastructure, the manpower, the know-how to build. And so it's a real shock to the system, that building. The engineering knowledge isn't there altogether in some ways. So it's very ambitious, probably not fully thought through, and it'll sit there unfinished for about a century. It takes a long time to complete for those reasons. But yeah, an amazing site. Beautiful view over Naples from where it is too, which everyone talked about at the time, talk about it even now. So
that beautiful view over Naples, everybody talked about it at the time. You're working on this book. You had to go see for yourself to make sure that it was really as good as they were saying, right? And you went once? No, you went how many times?
Many times.
Many times,
Yeah.
and you stayed for many, many days.
Oh yeah. Well, we were for not the last one of my sabbaticals. We lived in Naples, so Stephanie and I got to experience that together, which was really wonderful. we still have we have a whole store of Naples-related knowledge that we can reference with each other. But yeah, no, lots of times. In fact, the view has improved over the time I've been going because they'd kind of gotten overgrown near the edge of the property.
Right.
And the most recent director of the museum, he said, I want to restore the view. And so he went in and cleared a lot of that out. So now you can actually see over the city like you could formerly. Huh. So, yeah.
So talk to me a little bit about the process, the methodology, the process that one goes through. You're studying these palaces, you go to visit, you're staying there for, weeks, months, year, and you go back multiple times. What's the methodology? You wake up in the morning, you sit down and write, do you go out and take a look? I know there are personal photographs in there that both you and Stephanie took of not just the palaces themselves, but also of elements within the palaces, drawings, drawings. Give us a sense of your methodology, your mode of working.
Sure. Yeah. No. Well, it kind of varies. So they're going to the archives to find the payment documents or the documents that mention the building or describe its gestation. Going to libraries there to look at period books that talk about these contextual issues and looking at that. Going to the buildings, and visiting those multiple times, sometimes going into areas of the buildings that are off limits. So, you want to see under the roof and all of that.
Do you get permission to go to those spaces that are off limits?
Yeah, you do. You have to kind of, usually it involves meeting the director of something or such and being very formal and gracious and they're usually pretty accommodating too. They love, in Naples at least, they love outsiders because they don't get as many or didn't get as many Americans coming there to work.
I see.
And so those are special visits. I enjoy those. And then just going, there's great value in just spending time, just like with painting and sculpture and all art, but spending time in the space because architecture, doesn't travel, so you have to go to it, and then just comprehending spatially what you can see on drawings. Sometimes it feels different, and you have to go and experience it in order to kind of put the puzzle pieces together. And how is this space working, And then, looking at the drawings. Sometimes the drawings are in collections of museums. Sometimes one of these, Capodimonte, the early drawings for it, for example, there were two fragmentary ones in Naples. Naples suffered very badly in the Second World War, and so a lot of things got damaged. There were two fragmentary initial drawings of this building. And I don't know how I came upon it, but I found in a branch of the National Library in Paris that they had made copies. There were copies from the time period. And so, and those were perfectly preserved. Not only the two plans, but the elevation. So we know what the original elevation looked like, and it's not how it appears today. So there was a change made along the way. And I'm able to document then here for the first time what was that elevation. And so that was exciting too. But most everything's in and around Naples. Yeah.
So as you're piecing those elements together, right? So here's the building, the way that it ultimately gets constructed or maybe modified, but then here are the original drawings, and they don't match up. Responding to that question, well, what happened and how did this occur? Once you piece it together, is that, oh my goodness, I found something, or is it the step by step? I found this next one. I found this next. Talk to me about that, piecing it together and constructing a more complete story. How does that?
Yeah, that sometimes doesn't come together till right at the last, and sometimes you have open questions even, and you kind of have to fill in, because you aren't going to get the full story. If you did, there's no point in me writing it in a way, right? Because we're trying to reconstitute based on sometimes fragmentary evidence or what is the evidence, right? And to map that change, there are going to be gaps, and you have to explain the gaps or at least reason your way through them, right? So okay, the drawing we changed the staircase from here to what we see in this, what's mentioned in this document, and then it changes yet again from what's built. What happened? Why did that happen? you're not always told. Sometimes you are. And so it's really, I have to say, this is the most laborious part of the work for me. But it's very rewarding once you do feel like you finally cracked it. And when you're filling in, you're doing so responsibly, in connection with the actual material. And it's wonderful. It's like, those are the great moments where I'm just really excited.
Yeah.
And it's also, then you sort of have to come back to earth and say, okay, now so what?
Right, exactly.
Right?
Yeah. Or on to the next piece of the
yeah.
puzzle that needs to be constructed.
Yeah. So it's fun.
Nice. So Capodimonte took a century to build?
Yeah.
That's a long time.
Yeah. It's
How does the continuity, talk to us about the continuity, right? A single architect or a single person overseeing it, that's not how it works. So how does that continuity work, and what did you learn about that continuity piece that you might not have known before writing the book?
Yeah. Well, I think we're starting to, certainly in our time we have a very compressed view of what architecture is from the time something's proposed to the time it is built, right? Because we have budgets and timetables and all of that, right? Medieval architecture, for example, has long embraced huge spans of time where something is begun, but there's a knowledge it'll be continued on and changed and so forth, and so it's not this kind of sort of fixed design that we think of. And in the period I look at, now scholars are tending to shift more toward that approach even there. The thought for a long time was, well, the early Renaissance was the codification of planning in Europe, and so where you'd have a set plan and then it would be realized over time, and then any deviation from that plan was somehow a mistake or something like this. And instead, you look at something at these palaces, with the exception of one, there's kind of a great fluidity about it. And we know that the patron intervenes directly and frequently. So there's window frames at Capodimonte that get redesigned about 9 times because the king keeps changing his mind what he wants, and so it's clear that there was no fixed kind of this is what's going to happen. And over a century, the patron changes, the use changes. So hunting lodge, then it becomes a museum, then it becomes a palace, and then it goes back to being a museum, and that changes a lot.
Those changes I found to be fascinating because, I think about what happens to architectural structures here, even around town. Often you just raise the thing and then build the new thing. Not as often do we modify the interior and keep most of the structure. But that seemed to be the case, right? The structure essentially stays the same. There are some modifications, but as it changes use and changes purpose, they're not taking the whole thing down or taking grand parts of it down and putting it back up. That was pretty typical.
Yeah, that's very typical. Yeah. Well, because the expense of raising and rebuilding, we benefit from, robust supply chains that keep, relatively compared to this time period, the cost of materials down, right? Doing that would be very impractical in this time. Because the foundations themselves are enormously complex and deep oftentimes, and so to just raise and rebuild, it wouldn't make any sense.
But you have 100 years, that's a lot of time. I'm joking. So
your advocacy for a change on Capodimonte is duly noted.
Thank you. So Capodimonte wasn't the only one that was used as a museum. Actually, all 3 of them have elements of being sites of exhibition or museum.
Yeah, it's certainly the one that becomes most associated with it is Portici. This is a palace just at the base of Mount Vesuvius, and it's built very close to the ancient site of Herculaneum. And so when the royal government starts sponsoring systematic excavation at Herculaneum, they just bring the items up, they take them into the palace, they're restored there, they're publicized there, and they're eventually kept in a museum space in that building, kind of our first archaeological museum, a museum devoted to the artifacts from one site, and not just the kind of artworks that were, the paintings, which they did. Let's face it, they cut the pretty parts of the Pompeian wall frescoes out and took those out because they thought, well, that's the painting. The rest of the wall surface, who cares? So that was, I mean, modern archaeologists rightly decry that kind of approach. But nonetheless, they kept everything else. Like there was a petrified loaf of bread and, or calcified, whatever it is, a loaf of bread. And a kitchen, they'd set up an ancient kitchen. People loved to go see the ancient kitchen, and then they would make parallels with contemporary kitchens. They'd be like, oh, the kitchen. And, so, which people still do, right, when you go in those type of displays.
The third palace, Caserta, the largest, this is my notes, so help me understand if my notes are incorrect. Largest and most expensive palace.
Yes. It's huge.
It's expansive and expensive.
It's a very major project. And I mean, I remember, you take friends, Stephanie, you go there, and the first time you see it, you can't believe it. It's like, how did this little kingdom produce such a big building? And not just such a big building, such a refined building. It's one of these things that, you probably don't, this is where architectural historians or architects can get really excited about something that no one else probably cares about. The brickwork at the Palace of Caserta is so super. I mean, just the bricks themselves. They wouldn't take every brick over. They would discard, any faulty bricks. And because of that, though that area is very seismically active, that building has sustained very little damage because it was just so well built, even from something like that. Not to mention the marble that's on the inside and all of that. That's a part of it. So that when you're dealing with a structure that large, that's one of those times it begs the question, why, right? Why is this building so big and so lavish? It's completely misaligned with the political importance of the two Sicilies in Europe at the time, right? You expect something like that, maybe like Versailles in France. Expect something like that in Spain. You don't expect it in the two Sicilies. And that's when you start looking at the archives there, and you start to realize, well, they really did view it, and the context of economic writers, they viewed this as kind of a grand public works project as much as anything.
Because it is employing lots of people.
Yeah.
Right? And it is actually allowing that particular area to gain visibility, right? To gain importance. So the expense was essentially, one could say, worth it. It becomes an investment in some ways.
Yeah, because it was not an inhabited part of the kingdom. Because Caserta is outside of Naples. It wasn't. There was a small little town. There's nothing there, And when they decided to build a palace, Caserta is a pretty substantial city now. It's not, it's not huge, but and that growth all began with the palace. It's a bit like putting a university in the middle of Pennsylvania, and over time, look what happens.
It takes over 100 years for these things to grow. So at Caserta, there's also this giant aqueduct.
Yeah.
Right?
That's really wonderful.
It's really wonderful.
I think the aqueduct's splendid.
And it's part of the narrative of...
Yeah, no, that was to supply it wasn't just, so to bring water to the gardens, because you had the gardens, you had to have fountains in the garden and so forth. But not just, the aqueduct was intended to pass from Caserta to Naples, which it does eventually. So it supplies the fountains, but then moves on through down to the capital. So it has a public benefit that way. But to bring it in, they had to cross a valley with the aqueduct, because they're just using gravity, of course, and so you have to grade it, slowly across the whole terrain from, I forget how many miles away, 30 or so miles away. And to cross that valley, just like the Romans did, they built a multi-tiered arcaded structure, but it's the biggest one since the Romans in terms of its scale, which is amazing.
I thought that just having those two amazingly large structures in conversation with each other, right? Grandeur, engineering accomplishments, the ways that they relate to, again, back to those contexts. Putting those two in conversation really is important. Like talking about one without the other seems to do a disservice to the one that you're emphasizing.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you found that compelling, because that is one thing. Oftentimes their stories are told separately. Because one tends to attract the interest of people who are more interested in engineering, and the other tends to attract people more interested in kind of grander kind of architecture. But they're linked.
They are.
Yeah.
So speaking of linked, there's a another component that we haven't addressed, but that I really appreciate how you address in the book, not only ways in which you talk about them, but also the images, the photographs of them, but also the drawings, and that's the gardens. Right? We think of a palace as the structure, and the gardens are the gardens for the palace, but they're actually more integrated than that.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about the gardens?
Yeah, I mean, for the landscapes in these places they're kind of interesting and unique in the way that each one's different, let's say. Mm-hmm. So at Capo di Monte, the garden is off-center from the palace. They're not connected. They're connected across a street. But the gardens are a series of long avenues arrayed across the landscape, and the landscape has to even be kind of built up and stabilized for those avenues to be level. At Portici, instead, you have gardens on either side of a street, and they're kind of pieced together over time, buying up, this landowner's property and this one and this one and this one, and they're kind of stitched together. And even today, you can kind of see the seams between, say, the stitching of the land in some ways, because the plantings on this person's property were maybe, mulberry trees or something. Mm-hmm. They weren't. They were pomegranate trees, but something like that. Mm-hmm. Whereas this over here was a different type of garden. So you can witness that, and it's only really at Caserta where you get kind of an axial integration of garden with palace. So there's a great avenue where the channel of water and the fountains are all kind of arrayed coming down from the hillside, about a mile long, that axis. And it lines up with the center of the palace, through which there's an open corridor. And so you get this kind of continual, organizing axis from palace through palace out into gardens, and they're kind of bound together that way. That wasn't achieved in either of the other two. In all of them, though, gardens were not just about nice places to grow plants and stroll and everything else. They were about productivity, because there's a kind of economic thought in the middle of the 18th century that productive land is good land, that really pushed agriculture. And so there are farms that operate on these sites. That's a part of it. So farms to produce goods for the court, but not even farms that would supply beyond that. So.
Sure. And that, again, that's not something that I think most, at least in my experience, most people have talked to about palaces, right? The gardens and the ways in which they produce, plants, vegetables, whatever they might produce. That's not really part of what a palace is about.
Not when we think of it, no. But when you dig down, these were places of production. Yeah,
when you have an art historian who's a storyteller, you learn these things. So,
it's a fun story. One of the kind of nice details is when the workers are working at Caserta, there was a nearby property owner who was growing asparagus. And he complained. He said, the workers are coming and they're picking my asparagus to put on their salads. And can you stop them? So you can imagine. I mean, asparagus is hard. It takes a long time to grow. I'd be mad too. People just snapping up the asparagus. So anyway, sorry, that's just a small story.
Just picturing somebody really upset about the asparagus.
I know,
but I would be as well.
Yeah, that's right.
You talked a little bit about why you wrote the book. I mean, because it was interesting. I mean, you found these particular palaces interesting, and we look at the blurbs, we look at reviews. Folks will suggest what the contributions are of your book. But what do you think is the contribution or contributions your book, your scholarship about these palaces has provided us?
Well, I mean, it's at my most, the thing that means the most to me about doing this work is to bring attention to a corner that has not received it in some ways. I mean, we think, oh, well, Italy in this period, everyone studied Italy everywhere. Not true in some ways. And so I wanted to bring the light of my scholarship on places that had been kind of left out of some of those stories in English language literature. And it was just kind of, my interest went that way. And so I see part of the contribution is elevating, these particular buildings. But I think the broader contribution is to think about buildings and these palaces not merely as products of a context, right? They're not just results from a a court culture, a king, absolutism, even Enlightenment thought, but as active contributors to that, right? So they're not resulting from, but they're making it, right? So when the people are, the court ministers are talking about what are the economic benefits of architecture or buildings, because they're just already going up. So it's a discourse informed by the building there. And I think oftentimes in architectural history, we tend to see it another way around, where the ideas come first, you know, and then the embodiment of those in stone and mortar comes second. So I think I like to think that that's a contribution. And then the kind of contextual dives along through it, you know. I think that's, how can architecture be a lens onto many different things of the time and various important discourses within the art history of the 18th century, you know.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
One of my professors when I was in graduate school, he would talk about works of art as honorary people. If we treat works of art as honorary people, our first encounter with them is polite and we greet them. But the next time we engage with them, life has happened to us and life has happened to the other person, and the relationship grows and builds. Can you talk a little bit about these three palaces as honorary people? How did you come to know them better or differently with each encounter?
Yeah, it's funny you say that because it kind of reminds me of, I don't know, Luke Hahn saying, you say to brick, what do you want to be, right? But no, I have approached in my teaching, you know, let's interrogate the building. Let's, as we meet the building, certainly in the introductory courses for architectural history here that I've taught, I say, well, you know, treat the building like someone you want to get to know.
There it is.
Right? What do you want to know about them, right? And my first day of class in Art History 202N, I use Old Main. I said, what do you want to know about Old Main? Let's ask Old Main, you know. And so it is. It's a fun exercise. I will follow that up by saying, at the end of class, and my ultimate belief, the best part of doing something like this, is I tell them, as much as I love buildings, as much as I want to treat them like people,
Yes.
Buildings can't love you back. Only people can do that.
Aha.
And so the best part of researching and working on the book is really about the people I encounter, the historic people I encounter, but also the people who work in the archives, who, you know, were a part of assisting me in that work, that became friends, or the, you know, the people at the press, or the people, the colleagues who I spoke about ideas, or Stephanie, who's sort of more about palaces and Naples than anybody should be subjected to. Yeah. So that's what you treasure. So as much as, yes, treat them like people, honorary people.
That's it.
They're honorary, and don't lose sight of the real people.
Got it. I'm tempted to ask you what the palaces might have learned about you.
You know, there's a wonderful, this is going to sound really silly. Okay. There is, in a church in Naples, there's a little icon of that represents Christ on the cross. And supposedly this image spoke to Thomas Aquinas. And it said to Thomas Aquinas, Thomas, in Latin, of course, I don't know the Latin, but anyway, Thomas, you wrote good things of me. Oh. What would you have in return, anyway? And he says, to know you better. So it's this miracle that takes place. So I guess the palaces, I hope they would say, you wrote good things about me. You know? I hope they'd be happy.
I hope so too.
Yeah.
I'm sure they are. So you've sort of talked about in response to this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. You may have a different angle. What were the best parts of researching and writing the book?
Well, I mean, living in Naples is pretty wonderful.
Occupational, you know, hazard or something like that.
Yeah, I know. Well, Naples has its hazards now.
Yes,
Yeah,
sure.
But,
but you have to put up with living in Naples.
Yeah. I know it's true. It's as you know, as Stephanie jokes, she says, she was telling relatives and friends, "Oh, we'll be living, in Italy for a year," and of course they have, under the Tuscan sun in their mind, and she's like, "No, no, 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 no. We're talking about a dirty, chaotic, crowded place. 4 people on a moped, a family of 4 or 5 riding down the street, none of them with helmets, as you're trying to dodge, with traffic." So anyway, but it's wonderful. It's a wonderful place.
There's more research to be done there.
There's a lot more research to be done there. Yeah.
Sounds good. Again, one of the things that you mention in the book, you say something about these books don't share a singular interpretation of their construction, right? Mm-hmm. That we can, they don't begin at the same time. There are different ways to think about these buildings. Again, back to the contributions that this book provides us, how would you say the way that you look at research, tell us the stories about these buildings, how do you think that might inform others to do the same thing, to look at other buildings?
Well, I think people do. I think embracing a kind of diversity of approach within one book is liberating and fun. I find that great. Rather than kind of pursuing kind of one approach from beginning to end. Mm-hmm. But it just kind of depends on the project in a way, and it depends on you as a researcher. Mm-hmm. What do you want to do, This is what I wanted to do. And if other people want to take a similar approach, super, it's a great approach. But I also, I really believe that, I really value work that pursues a variety of approaches, mm-hmm. as long as it succeeds in its ends that it sets out. Mm-hmm. And you can tell the person, did it bring them joy in doing this? Mm-hmm. You can tell.
Yeah,
Those are great things to read.
Nice.
That's great scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if other people will do multiple kind of methodological snippets, great, but mm-hmm. I'm not trying to blaze a path or anything.
Well, we'll see. Other folks take up this approach or even reference that this approach came from, you're reading your book. Perhaps mm-hmm. you are a path blazer or a trailblazer.
I'm more modest.
You're more modest than
that. I'm more modest than that.
Okay, all right. Maybe a trail warmer.
That's right.
The thinking through these contextual lenses, I was actually thrown a bit by the structure of the book. There are chapters to the book, so you can't be too thrown by that. But you lay out this nice argument. Here's this notion of these contexts and these lenses through which we might be able to consider these palaces. And then you say, okay, here's the first chapter's on Capodimonte. The second chapter's on this. Third chapter's on Caserta. The chapters could have been about the context, and then you talk about all 3 palaces in relationship to the context, but you decide to go a different way and say, no, this chapter is only on Caserta, but it's not just about, right, through the lenses, but there are references back and forth. Why chapters on why frame your chapters that way, each palace, rather than the context or the chapters in the palaces play out?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have a very dull answer to this. It was practical, and it made more sense to me mm-hmm. to do it that way. I envy people who can use the concepts to kind of frame mm-hmm. in a way. Mm-hmm. I've always been, my mind kind of structures around an object mm-hmm. or a series of objects, and that's kind of gives the kind of shape to what I'm doing. So that's why I did it that way, just because it's how I kind of operate. Mm-hmm. And it makes it, I would hate to be unsuccessful at a different approach, I guess. But it's good to try different approaches, but I think it was to just lay it out that way seemed the easiest mm-hmm. thing. It's kind of a boring answer, but...
No, it's the answer. It's the answer. And I tell you what, it worked really well for me.
Good.
It worked really well for me. And again, I found the book readable mm-hmm. or readerly. I guess Roland Barthes says they're readerly text and writerly text, and readerly texts are written well, and writerly texts are readable. At any rate, you did both.
Well, thank you.
I have 5 questions I want to finish with, but before I get to them, I gotta ask this question, and then we'll open it up after the. What's the next project, Robin Thomas?
The next project is about the city in the period of the Enlightenment, and it's structured around kind of certain thematic cuts through the city, and how buildings that were created to improve urban life often encountered resistance. So I have one on kind of charitable institutions, hospices and hospitals. And there's a great fluidity across these type of buildings. And then sometimes, you know, they're built to grand fanfare and they're incredibly enormous. They're either not completed or people don't use them in that way. So there's some resistance to that. And then I have one on buildings for entertainment and things like that, because the 18th century really is the time where the kind of architecture of cities in Europe is established, you know, with large public buildings like we think of today. So, you know, opera houses, museums, or theaters, museums, things like that. And so looking at these thematically, in this case, by type, but thinking, you know, not in terms of like listing a whole bunch of types, so here's one, here's one, here's one, here's one, but right, what are the thoughts going into making them, picking just a case study or two, and how are those manifesting also a kind of human activity that sometimes doesn't go along with them. So that's the next project.
That's the next project.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Fantastic. I want to get to these 5 questions.
Okay.
I think I have 1, 2, 3, yes, 5.
Okay.
Other than this book, Palaces of Reason, The Royal Residences of Bourbon, Naples, what's your favorite book?
It's and I would never put my book in this. That would be
I got you off the hook.
That'd be incredibly narcissistic, right? You know? Well, it's my first book, actually, is my first. No. It's Don Quixote, actually.
Don Quixote, why?
It's a story of just warm humanity. You know, we think it's a story about a person who's disconnected from reality, but it's a person who celebrates the life-giving and affirming quality of fiction, right? This is, you know, the last lines where, you know, Cervantes says, "Now I hang my pen on a copper wire. You know, Don Quixote's lived only for me and I for him." You know, he's kind of pulling back the curtain on the fiction, and it is a fiction, but it's the most wonderfully transporting one, you know, along the way, and the rich friendship between Sancho Panza and Don Quixote too. Storytelling, right? It's a story about storytelling oftentimes. So there's just so much there that I love.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. What's your favorite word?
Tough. That's not my favorite word. Tough. Hope. I like the way hope expresses the kind of leaning into a expectation or a belief in the possibility of a better future, right? Hope, right? You know, almost kind of, you know, it's a word you kind of lean into, right? And it's a word that expresses not what we know, and that's a kind of somewhat scary but exciting thing too.
Right.
So.
And not what we know, but what might be in something positive.
Yeah, positive. Yeah, no, yeah, not something. Yeah,
That
not
might
apprehension.
be,
Yeah.
absolutely. What is your least favorite word?
This is quite easy. Impact. I hate impact. I find the word aggressive. Take out the vowels. Right? I mean, just listen to that. It's really ugly.
Yeah.
And not only that, it gets used to kind of quantify or evaluate the importance of things. You know, let something be joyful or wonderful or spectacular or meaningful or not, but don't let it be impactful. You know? So,
right.
Unfortunately, it is a word that's commonly used.
It's used often.
Used often, and so I grit my teeth and bear it for when I need to use it.
I'm predicting it will be used less often in the future, at least by some of us in this room, particularly those of us who might, know that we're sharing what we've written with you, and you'd have to read it. So.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. All the grad students, they're taking notes there. Yeah.
Find, replace. Isn't that a function in Word?
Yeah.
What is your favorite place to spend time?
Well, I'm a traveler. I love to go. And so there's no one place. I love to, the act of going is fun. But then I also, but I settling in, we have a fireplace in the living room in the winter months. And, that's wonderful. So being in those spaces. My family's in the furniture business, so the interior spaces of our house are special.
Nice.
And that's, yeah.
Okay, we'll take that one. All right, you sort of answered this question already, and I'm going to ask it, even though you presented the question early and then responded to it, but I'm going to show you that this is actually the question I was going to ask you, and you answered that one already.
What would I be?
If you were not an art historian, what profession would you pursue?
Yeah, it would be a poet. I'll tell you that my second grade teacher, Kay Miller, she was a great teacher, and I remember she told us the first day of class, we weren't in first grading, we were in second grade. So now it's time to adopt, the sobriety of second grade.
Yeah.
And then she went on to say, and we are going to write poetry. And we did. It was one of those things, we wrote poetry. It shows you how important it is to introduce something like that early on. And so we wrote poetry. And I guess since that time, that's kind of what made me feel like that would be. I mean, I wouldn't be a good poet. That's why I didn't do it. I mean, I'd be a horrible poet, But I've, I went to college, and there were opportunities to hear great poets, come in and do readings and things like that. And that was great. So, heard all kinds of people come in and speak. Even at a later point, a poet lived downstairs from me. Kevin Young. He's now the director of the National Museum of the African American Museum in Washington, as part of the Smithsonian.
Oh, yeah. Right.
So, but he's a poet. So
look at that.
So poets can, I don't know how he feels about shifting over to administration from poetry. So poetry's been a companion all along the way.
Love it.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, your book certainly reads in ways that, at least for me, poetry gives me joy and an entry into worlds I wasn't imagining. Your book reads like that for me as well.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Robin.
Thank you. It's a great compliment.
Yes. All right, we're going to open it up now. Questions for Robin Thomas? Yes, go ahead.
So you spoke a lot about how this wasn't previously documented, you kind of were the first to delve into this version, into these palaces. And so I was just wondering, what was the process like with gathering your sources and knowing where to go and how to organize the material that you were getting, since it was the first time that anybody was doing this kind of in-depth research?
Yeah, I should qualify and say I'm not I shouldn't say I'm the absolute first to do any of it. There are bits and pieces that have been done before. But it hadn't all been pieced together in kind of one kind of comprehensive story. So you can always find where the bits have been told, and you can look at where they're getting their material from in their footnotes, and you follow the trail. The other thing you do is you talk to archivists, and you tell them what you're working on, and they tend to know their archives very well, and they'll say, well, let me show you something. There was one who was kind of notoriously difficult in one of the archives, and he would kind of shuffle in and then quickly get out or go in the back room, and they said, if you want to know about that, you need to talk to Dr. De Mattia here. And so I finally got to talking to him out in the courtyard. He was out there. I found him one day. He was smoking a cigarette, so I went over to him and started talking about, he loved Westerns. And so we talked about Westerns. And then he said, well, let me what are you working on? I tell him, let me show you some things. And he showed me all the payment documents and where they were. And nobody published them, but he lived with that stuff, so he knew where it was. And so it is, when I said peoples and relationships, a part of that story too. And then sometimes just doing searches, you know, a lot of collections are digitized now, and, you know, just going through in databases and querying different terms, you know. Something may be in a collection, it may not be correctly identified in a collection, right? So you can go through and do that and think of, okay, well, maybe if I didn't know what this was, what might I describe it as, right? And do that. So that's part of it too, yeah.
That's great. Thank you. I think there was a hand over here. Yes, in the back.
So first, I know my mom would be very happy to hear that Don Quixote is your favorite.
Well, good.
But my question is, so one of my favorite things about books is covers. So I was wondering, like, what made you choose the image, or like, what was your input on that?
Yeah, no, Penn State Press has a really great design team, and so they presented me with two options, and they pulled this together using images from the book that I had, and so I forget what the other was, but this is the one I liked better, and so I just essentially said that one, you know, and I think it really looks good, so I'm delighted with it, but that's why a good press will have a good design team, and that's great, yeah. I always feel sad for books that have bad covers. Right? You know, I mean, sometimes you're just like, what were they thinking? You know? One of the architectural history survey texts that I assign as a possible reading in the survey class, I just look at it and feel like, could you make this seem any more depressing than what you have chosen to put on the front? You know? Anyway. So.
Bad choice. Yes.
I have a horrible commercial brain that immediately says, is it being translated into Italian? Have you worked out relationships with the gift stores at these many museums to offer the book?
That's great, both. Yeah, you're hired. Yeah, I mean, no, I know the directors of some of these places already have the gift shops. The problem with the press is distribution. How do they get it over there to them and things like that? But I should, next time I'm in Naples, I'll talk with them about that. That's right.
Suitcases.
Yeah.
Field trip.
Hit the weight limit. What's the weight limit? You go right up to it.
Aren't you taking a class over soon? Everybody's suitcase.
That's right. That's a very self-interested reason to take a study group. Everyone will be required to take one bag. That's right. It's loaded with books.
That's a great idea.
But the translation, no, I haven't been approached by anybody, but there may be a possibility. I haven't thought about it, but it would be.
I didn't know if there was a collaborator over there. You said you worked with a number of scholars who said, wow, when this is done, you know, it should be available to the Italian community as well.
Yeah, maybe either too early or they just don't like it. No, no. But I should. Yeah.
Well, congratulations, Robert.
Thanks.
Absolutely. Yeah. Are there other questions? Yes.
The title of the book, I'm inspired, actually, because I have been thinking about this, and then the poetic sort of turn. I've been intrigued by the title, because on the one hand, there's a certain straightforward descriptive quality to it, but then there's also these other invitations, like palaces of unreason. What is a palace of reason in opposition to?
Yeah, or unreasonable palaces. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just wondering, but I have a feeling you gave this a lot of thought, and I was wondering about the sort of elusiveness and what was happening there.
Yeah, I mean, I conceived of it in a dual way, right? There's reason, as in the concept of the 18th century that's so powerful as a part of the Enlightenment, but then there's reason in the sense of, why, the why, right, in a way. So that's kind of how I alighted on reason, because I view it as doubly kind of doing a double service that way, talking about, what's the justification, what are the reasons for the buildings, multiple in a multiple sense, and then them taking place in this period of the Enlightenment, and being engaged with Enlightenment ideas, at least in some of their constructions and so forth, then that's the broader part there. I hadn't thought of what the flip side is, unreasonable palaces, but that's, yeah, I know. Those are the ones you don't want to get to know as a person.
That's
right.
right.
They're irascible and
They might start throwing their own bricks at you.
that's right. That's right.
Maybe the opposite is chaos.
Yeah,
Brings
yeah.
us back to Naples and kind of and ordering
Yeah.
the city in a kind of
Yeah.
thinking way.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's also there is a highly kind of crystallized clarity and plan with these too. I mean, there's one of the architect of one of them, Van Vitelli, he presented an idea. He said, this for Caserta, he said, look, we could do a palace where from the center of the building you could look out and you could see courtyards ornamented in 4 different ways. And, the sovereign said, no, they're going to be all regular, right? And it's that there is a kind of adherence to a kind of restrained kind of rationalization of ornament that's a part of that. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Yes.
It's funny that Kathy talked about the palace of unreason, because when I imagine palaces, I tend to think both of them as unreasonable palaces because they're sites of conspicuous consumption. And I really like your argument that these palaces were actually sites of production and probably even of public good. So I just want to hear you talk a little bit more about that aspect, especially in terms of the money flow, like how it was financed and whether it was actually making a profit, how labor was involved, and what kind of public good it actually created.
Yeah, well, it's, economic thought of the time tends to gauge growth in terms of people. It was a population equation. So for them, if the population is growing in a certain area, then that was benefiting, right? And that's kind of how they see things working. So, we would cut that a bit differently. But yeah, I mean, they're expending in terms of resources, it's 10% of the kingdom's income is going into these buildings. So it's substantial, right? And you don't get to that amount just because the king needs a place to live, right? Because otherwise it's completely disproportionate. But there was a thought at the time that money, in order for wealth to grow, money had to flow. They weren't advocating at this time a kind of savings model of economic growth. They were saying, the metaphor of one of the economists in Naples is, you can't keep money like a barrel. It has to come through that. And their ideas of debt spending are much different than ours. I mean, they did finance a lot and pay back over a long time, but that was a very common thing. I mean, people were government sovereigns, they were enormously indebted in this period too. So, but yeah, you're talking about the revenue comes from all sorts of ways. There's of course certain land taxes. There's revenue off the land that the crown owns itself. There's certain contributions from noble groups that come in kind of on special occasions. So there's a lot. It's a complex and not altogether clear. It's a bit murky trying to reestablish how revenue works at a government level in this time, because they're not as centralized as we are.
Great. Yes.
Just going off of that, how do they calculate population?
Well, you calculate it by number of households. Yeah, so generally, but then,
Buildings and houses, that way?
what's that?
Buildings and the number, take an average number of
Yeah, you
houses.
can take number of houses there. Although they do, essentially in some of these smaller communities, they assess they will do a census essentially of all the individuals, not kingdom-wide. But yeah, you typically, what they refer to, I think, in documents as, I think they may even call them chimneys, even though not all of them had chimneys, but I think that's how they they calculate that. I don't know enough.
I'm just asking because that's how they're doing it in 18th century South Asia.
Oh, really?
The first population, as you calculate the houses, assume so many number of people per house.
Sure. Oh,
Makes
okay.
sense.
With the
Well,
quality of the building.
yeah, yeah,
So that makes
yeah, yeah.
sense in the 18th century.
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense. Yes.
Did you come across any documented resistance to expenditures at that level? Did anybody, dare grumble that they would seem so outsized in relation to the population?
I kind of wanted to in Naples, and I couldn't. I mean, there wasn't much. And I think because the economic benefits tended to be relatively positive. Now, where you find criticism, if you go outside of that, yes, you find criticism, right, of big palaces. So David Hume goes and sees the residence at Würzburg, which is a prince bishop in central Germany, and he says this is completely disproportionate. Even Frederick II of Prussia, who builds big palaces himself, he looks at lesser peers and says, oh my gosh, can you believe they're building palaces like that? So there's some of that you find. And then in Britain in particular, the one that really gets kind of debated in a withering way is Blenheim Palace. Blenheim is a palace north of Oxford, built for the Duke of Marlborough after his victory over Louis XIV at Blenheim city. And it's paid for by the public purse. It's paid for part by public funds. And so when it's getting bigger and bigger and more expensive, you get public critique. But not as much as you would think would be there. Because the 18th century is a period of discourse, right, where you debate and talk about buildings. And more often what you'll find is, like in France, the public discourse of how shameful it is that the east front of the Louvre still had no roof over it in 1740, whatever, So it's a different type of discourse that you find.
And would you find that when these buildings were announced, that there would be any sort of justification that, well, this is going to benefit the population at large?
No, and that's so you do have to, you're looking to letters of ministers or people close to the court or writers like that, because usually an announcement would come out in an official publication. It would be very brief. It would be the stone laying, His Majesty attended that, and that would be it.
Minimal PR.
Yeah, kind of minimal PR. But you have ambassadors' reports. Ambassadors love to talk about it. They'd be writing, from wherever and saying, well, the king came in today and he showed me all the marble that will be used inside the palace, and he was proud of this one and this one and this one and this one. So that comes from an ambassador's report, yeah.
Nice.
The marble's all quarried within the kingdom, too. That's the other thing. It has to be domestic.
Has to be domestic. All right. Any other questions? Not bad for our first one out of the
Oh, well,
chute there.
thank you. This has been
Dr.
delightful
Robin
for me.
Thomas.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Thank you all. Look forward to seeing you at our next event. I'm not sure when that is, so I'm not going to give you any dates, but be on the lookout for news and an announcement. So we still serving beverages back there? We are. All right. Talk, drink, enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. This was great. Yeah.